Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum. We're based in the town of Salisbury in Northwest Connecticut. We host nationally recognized speakers in free public forums. To learn about our upcoming events, please go to our homepage and join our email list. Our website, you can Google us very easily, just Salisbury Forum, and it will pop up. We're also on Facebook if you want to follow us there. If you or your friends miss one of our talks, they're all available on our website under videos. So we hope you'll join us at 7:30 on March 19th to hear Bonnie Glaser speak about China and US foreign policy. We rely on contributions from our audience, people like you, to cover our operating expenses. We're very grateful for any contribution you've made and hope you will consider one this year if you haven't already done so. We'd like to thank Sharon Hospital, which is part of Nuvance Health, for their grant this year in helping to make tonight's forum possible. We'll have a Q&A period at the end of David Pogue's talk, so you click on the chat icon at the bottom center of your screen to type in any questions you may have, and then I'll be reading the questions to David and he'll be happy to answer them. We're delighted to have David Pogue with us tonight. His impressive background includes being a technology columnist for the New York Times, a 5-time Emmy Award winner for his stories on CBS Sunday Morning, a New York Times bestselling author, and a host of 20 PBS science specials on Nova. What you may not know is that he also spent 10 years conducting and arranging Broadway musicals and has even written 2 novels for middle school children. He's now delved into the existential challenge of our time with his new book, How to Prepare for Climate Change, a practical guide to surviving the chaos. As always, it's available at Oblong Books and Music in Millerton, New York. So with that, David, I'd like to welcome you to the Salisbury Forum.
Thank you very much. And this is Wilbur, who insists every time on being in between me and the camera, no matter what, whether it's a Zoom or a presentation or what. So Wilbur begs your forgiveness and your indulgence. Thank you so much, Mary. I've really been looking forward to this event. I am a fellow Connecticutian, and I have actually got a slide deck prepared. So I'm going to hit share screen and see. Now, unfortunately, this is a webinar format, so I can't actually see any of you. So I have taken the liberty of copying and pasting the Salisbury Forum audience from a previous speaker, and I'm going to use that to welcome myself. Thank you very much. That's really very kind of you. Thank you. Anyway, as Mary mentioned, this book came out just last week, 2 years in the making. It's called How to Prepare for Climate. It's well, not just pre-orders, now available to buy. Everybody was very fussy about my not exceeding that delicate 11-hour keynote speaker limit. So I'm taking the liberty of giving you a condensed version, the talk. So John Holdren was Barack Obama's chief advisor, and he famously gave this quote to the New York Times with regard to climate change. He said, "We basically have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be." So what I find very interesting is that we've heard a lot about mitigation. That simply means stopping climate change. It means taking steps to reduce how much fossil fuel energy we produce, to drive electric cars, to eat less red meat, to fly less. I mean, every one of you could name some examples of ways to cut your carbon footprint. And that's all really important, and we should all keep doing that with every fiber of our beings. However, nobody pays attention to the second part of the formula, which is adaptation. This means adapting, coping with the changing climate. I find it incredible that the percentage of attention between these two approaches is so lopsided. For many years, I think climate scientists were uncomfortable with the notion of allowing the masses to think about adaptation, because the fear was, if you think about climate change that's already here, you'll take your eye off the ball of mitigation. I think that's changed. I think nowadays most scientists think we need to do both as hard and fast as we possibly can. Now, corporations and governments routinely um, routinely think about adaptation. That's why they build seawalls and they consider moving the farmland north and so on. But this book is for individuals. This How to Prepare for Climate Change is for families, individuals, mere mortals, non-corporate entities, and that's what I'm going to cover a little bit today. You know that disasters are coming your way, you just don't know when. So why wouldn't you take some steps to prepare? I'll warn you about this talk. I spend quite a bit of time on the outline. It breaks down into basically two parts, the depressing part and the shakily reassuring part. I experimented with different sequences of these two things. I decided it would be smarter to start with the depressing part and go on to the shakily reassuring part. Please spare me your criticism of my photoshopped happy mask there. I did try to Google shakily reassuring and I found nothing. I tried. Anyway, so you've probably heard about the greenhouse effect. The idea is heat the surface of the Earth. Some of that heat bounces back in the form of radiation, infrared energy, and that gets trapped by this outer shell, this blanket of gases like carbon dioxide and methane. This is entirely normal. This is the way it's been for millennia. This is what prevents the Earth from going baseball. We need that blanket of gases there to keep our heat. What's different, though, is that blanket is getting thicker. And that coincides very tidily with the 1850s when we started burning coal, oil, and gas. So we're trapping more of the outgoing heat. That, of course, is what's called the greenhouse effect. I think it's a terrible name, by the way, because how many Americans have ever been in a greenhouse, know that a greenhouse is 20 degrees warmer inside than outside? I don't think very many. If you ask me, we should rename it the dog in the car effect, because if you've ever left your car parked on a sunny day and gone in shopping, you come in, you find that it's baking inside. It's exactly the same phenomenon. The sun's rays have heated the interior of the car. It emits infrared radiation that can't escape. It gets hotter and hotter. In this analogy, we're the dog. So again, this business of the carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere, this is entirely natural. It's been going on this way every 100,000 years or so. We have an ice age or a massive heating up. What's different is what's happened this time. If you'll direct your gaze to the far right end of this graph, you'll see something that's never before happened in 12 million years. The carbon dioxide levels have never gone up this fast or this high. So that's what we're worried about. And if we are to zoom in on the right end, we will see that it exactly coincides with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, if we superimpose temperatures on this graph, you'll see something really profound. It's a really tight correlation between the greenhouse gas buildup and the hottening of the planet. This is why climate scientists think there's some relationship between the building up of those gases and the heating of the Earth. We're making that blanket around the Earth thicker. 152 million tons a day of added greenhouse gases from all of these major sources. And I was mentioning that I don't actually like the term global warming because it connotes thoughts that all we're worrying about is warmer summers or something. The change in climate entails, freak heat and freak snowstorms. It's freak droughts and intense rains. It's massive flooding and massive water shortages, which might seem counterintuitive. But that's the thing is nature is this interconnected network of systems. And when you raise one throttle, a lot of other stuff gets messed up at the same time. So we're seeing, of course, wildfires and hurricanes in the Pacific Northwest, these unbelievable infestations of beetles eating and killing 100,000 trees a day of forest. The tick habitat is growing. We're losing crops. Get this climate migration, and then a bunch of wackier effects that you might not guess. We are seeing the tornado alley of the United States is shifting eastward, which is a really peculiar side effect. The beaches are getting smaller. Chocolate is getting more expensive. We're seeing more kidney stones. Certain kinds of goats are getting smaller. PSAT scores are dropping. And all of these these are like secondary and tertiary effects, but they are all ultimately related to the changing of the systems we've got. So that's why I'm not crazy about the term global warming. I've heard climate chaos. That's a pretty good term. I've heard global weirding. I like that term too. That's a little more realistic. Now, it's not the world's greatest observation to say that 2020 was a terrible year for lots of reasons. Not exactly an earth-shaking bit of news there, but it did feature some truly historic milestones for the United States and the world. For example, it was the hottest year ever recorded in human history. It featured the hottest temperature ever measured on the planet. That's 130 degrees in Death Valley, California this summer. It featured the biggest wildfires ever recorded. Some of you may remember the horrible, horrible situation in California, Oregon, and Washington. They burned the entire equivalent land area of Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island. This is a shot from, well, this shows you the growing wildfire prevalence. And this is a shot from San Francisco taken at 12 noon during the wildfires. I mean, it looked like twilight. And this was, of course, the worst air quality measured on the planet, 4 times worse than Beijing. So, yay, America. This is an infrared shot of the smoke plume from those wildfires that reached all the way to New York. So we saw hazy yellow skies 3,000 miles away. And it's not just the United States, of course. This was Australia's wildfires last year. I just read that they're starting up again now. The smoke circled all the way around the globe. This was Siberia. They had not only wildfires in Siberia, which is supposed to be a cold tundra, but a record heat wave that hit 100 degrees in freaking Siberia. I mean, just unbelievable. This I've called the bitterly ironic photo of the year. Wear a mask, wash your hands, come join us. Senior Center. 2020 also, we had the most hurricanes in one season. As you may know, they go through the alphabet of men's and women's names. And this year we actually went through the whole alphabet and had to start using Greek letters. That's how many hurricanes we had. That's all pretty depressing, but not as depressing as this. 93% of the newly trapped heat goes into the oceans. So the problem is you can't change the ocean's temperature just by turning a knob. It would take generations for the water to cool down. So we're not going to see anything change, even if we were able to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, which, by the way, we won't. But even if we did, in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, you would still not see any return to the weather we knew in, let's say, the 80s. So the weather, the extreme weather, and the crazy broken systems you're seeing right now are it. We're here for the rest of your life. So that's why I think it's time to make preparations. This is the water cycle. You might have learned this in elementary school. Water, as the earth warms, there's more evaporation from the oceans. That turns into more precipitation, which turns into rain and snowstorms and hurricanes. That puts more water back into the oceans, and around it goes. The bottom line is the more moisture in the air, the bigger the storms and the more intense rains. These are the extreme rainstorms going back to the 50s. You can see a trend here. This was last year in Washington, D.C. They got 6.5 inches of rain in a single day. This was the dams that broke in Michigan this past year, flooded out a couple of cities there. Pretty disastrous situation. And it was a big problem for the breadbasket of America. 2/3 of Nebraska's farmland counties had to declare a state of emergency because they were flooded out. And when they're flooded like that, you can't grow stuff. So that made the farmers lose money, and it made food more expensive for everybody else. If there's any humor at all to be found in in the State of Weather 2020. This is it. This is the Noah's Ark replica of Kentucky. And incredibly, they had to file for $1 million worth of insurance reimbursement because they got flooded. It's pretty hilarious. This was Hurricane Katrina, as you know, pretty disastrous. 2005 killed 1,800 people. This is Hurricane Sandy. This is more of our own East Coast pride and joy, the biggest hurricane ever recorded, 1,000 miles across. And part of what does the damage, by the way, is the storm surge. You hear the weather.com people say this all the time, and I was never clear exactly what it was. What it means is the wind pushes this big mound of water onto the shore. And because the sea level, the sea floor is rising, that pushes the mound of water higher. And then as it enters a bay or harbor, those land masses confine the water even more. So it gets taller and taller and taller. During Hurricane Katrina, the storm surge was 28 feet tall. Can you imagine seeing like a 3-story building coming at you? Pretty terrible. You may remember this is what New York City looked like during Hurricane Sandy. You keep hearing this term, 100-year floods and 100-year storms. Well, in the old days, storms of Sandy size would occur once every 500 years. By 2017, we were getting one of those storms every 25 years. And they predict that by the middle of the century, we'll be getting a storm like that once every 5 years. So it's a changing sort of new normal. If you add up all these things, the wildfires and the flooding and the hurricanes and so on, these are all the weather catastrophes. And you can see just a general trend here going back to 1980. Things are generally getting worse weather-wise. So a lot of people ask me, well, what about climate deniers? What about the doubters? And I find it an interesting point because what does climate denial actually mean? Does that mean you don't think that the climate is changing? That you see the headlines about the wildfires and the hurricanes and the floods and you don't believe it, or you don't think it's any different from it was when we were growing up? I don't think that's what a climate denier is. I think the number of people who don't think anything is amiss is vanishingly small. What I think these days a denier is somebody who doubts that human activity is causing this change, that burning fossil fuels has nothing to do with it. This is all a natural cycle. It is true that even those numbers of people are dropping a lot. The Yale Center for Climate Change Communications does a big American survey every year. And in the most recent survey, the number of people who think this is a natural cycle is down to 37% of the American population. That's much lower than it had been. It's still surprisingly high to me, but one expert I talked to said, well, in this polarized environment, when you can get 50% of the country to agree on anything, you're ahead of the game. And he reminded me that 20% of Americans believe that aliens walk among us. So, there's no accounting. So anyway, overall, this is what Americans think now is climate change human cause. About a third say no. But the beautiful thing about this is, for the purposes of this book, How to Prepare for Climate Change, it doesn't matter. I don't care what you think the cause is. The point is, things are getting intense. 25 million Americans a year are getting hit by these weather disasters, and you've got to start getting ready. So that brings us to the book. The book literally covers everything I could think of that has to do with making yourself more resilient from these disasters. So it's where to live and how to build and what to grow, where to invest, how to insure, how to protect your children. And then there are individual preparation chapters on heat waves, drought, flood, tornadoes, wildfires, and so on. So in order to keep this talk from going on for 48 hours, I'm just going to give you a few highlights from the book, some of the things that I found the most interesting. One question that comes a lot is, okay, so clearly Florida is in trouble. New York, believe it or not, coastally is the next most endangered sea level rise hotspot. California, West Coast is enmeshed in wildfires. So if we have a choice to move, if we want climate change to factor into our decision about where to retire or where to get a new job or where to go when we get married or divorced or whatever, this is how to think about it. You want to be far enough inland from sea level rise and flooding. This is a really cool website called Surging Seas. It lets you use the slider on the left to dial up how much sea level rise you expect in the next 50 years. And then you can see on a map any address you want. So this is my town where I live right now, Westport, Connecticut. And this is showing, if we drag the sea level rise slider upward, you can see that for every foot higher the sea level rise goes, you get 500 feet inland of that water inundating your basements and your streets and your businesses. This is Boston, same thing. You can see they're in substantial trouble by 2150, 2100, but that's nothing compared to Miami. I mean, Miami, the experts tell me, is just a lost cause. Miami, you can't protect it with a seawall because the water comes up from under the ground. It's porous rock. And if you zoom out, you can see the entire southern tip of Florida is a poor bet. What you're looking at right here was not taken during a hurricane. This is what they call sunny day flooding. This is just high tide now. The water is rushing inland and flooding Miami even on sunny days. So there's no rainfall that day, but it was a high tide coupled with rising sea level. The problem with Florida is you're already getting an effect on real estate values. So I don't know how many of you have homes in Florida or plan to retire there, but already the real estate values are dropping along the shoreline. And by 2030 and later, I mean, it's really a poor bet real estate wise. So anyway, so you want to get inland from the sea level rise. You want to be far enough north that you avoid the heat and the mosquitoes and the ticks. You want to be west far enough to avoid the hurricanes, and you want to be east far enough to avoid the wildfires of the West Coast. And then there's one more element that you don't hear talked about very much that I think is one of the biggies, and that is water to drink. The entire western half of the United States is more or less in perpetual drought these days. I mean, where do we get our drinking water? Well, depending on where you live, it might come from aquifers, these big underground stores of water, and those are record lows all over the world. Out west, they get their water from snow melt. So the winter snows up on mountains melt, and we get the rivers and the creeks filled with the water that comes down. And now that the winters are shorter and warmer and the spring is coming sooner, that water is not as copious and it's melting much faster. It's pretty serious. In Nevada and California, they get a lot of their water from the Hoover Dam, or rather the lake created by it, Lake Mead, and it's now only a third full. It's down 117 feet in the last 20 years. So we have to think about where are we going to get our drinking water. So if you add all that up, if you want to avoid all the extreme weather and have water, where do you go? Well, the answer is above the 42nd parallel. That's that line right there. And what all the experts tell me is that, the Pacific Northwest is a good bet, although they do have the beetles and they do have wildfires. But if you want even less trouble than that, it's the Rust Belt. It's the Great Lakes, all those grand old cities that used to be much more populous than they are. They have the infrastructure, they have room to grow, they have airports and sports teams and symphonies and culture, and they have the Great Lakes. So they will have clean, fresh water forever. I'm from Cleveland, and man, are people like my father happy when they hear that Cleveland keeps popping up on the list of the best climate haven cities these days. Of course, there's more to choosing a place to live than just climate. You also want to think about things like the culture, the teams, the transportation, what's the cost of living. In Cleveland right now, $1 here in Connecticut will buy you $2.71 worth of stuff in Cleveland. That's how low the cost of living is there. So anyway, so in the book, I went through 15 cities and of the best options for climate havens. And the number one town believe it, is Madison, Wisconsin. Absolutely beautiful. All these magazines and websites keep ranking it, number one, fittest city, nicest people, best city for a family, best quality of life. And they have this law that no building can ever be built high enough to block the view of the Capitol building, because of course it's the capital of the state. And so for that reason, it'll never be a concrete jungle. It never becomes sprawling and overwhelming. And it's built around 5 beautiful lakes. Burlington, Vermont is another cool place. You might be saying to yourself, well, both of these cities are very cold in the winter. And that's traditionally true, but both of these cities have warmed 5 degrees since 1970 in the winter, and they're expected to go up another 13 degrees by the middle of the century. So those winters are becoming milder and milder. What's cool about Burlington is it feels like a seaside town, but instead of the sea, it's on Lake Champlain, which is a lake, and it's 500 square miles, and its level is not going to rise and flood you. They have very low obesity, highly educated, the lowest crime rate in the country, and really good cheese, maple syrup, and ice cream. Buffalo is another city my experts kept suggesting. It's on Lake Erie. Niagara Falls is like a day trip. Great medical facilities, cheap land, and really good chicken wings. So these are the cities. The main thing is the Great Lakes, baby. If you or your kids have a choice, time to think about the Great Lakes. Another big chunk of the book is where to invest. The premise here is that as we decarbonize the planet, trillions of dollars are going to be changing hands. And people who play their cards right are going to make money from that. There is, of course, an argument that it's pretty crass to think about investments when a lot of people are suffering. Climate change, as I'm sure you've read, disproportionately affects people of color and people in poor communities. So is this really the way to think about it? And I was convinced that the answer is yes, for one simple reason. When you are investing in clean infrastructure, clean energy, you are supporting companies that are helping to make the problem better. These are all companies who will make climate change less severe. So in a way, you're doing both. You're protecting yourself and you're protecting the planet. So the first thought might be, well, do we really want to put money into speculative things like clean energy? And the answer is, yeah, you do. As you know, the stock market's been on this historic roll for the last 10 years. And energy stocks, that is petroleum companies, has been the worst performer of any sector. That's how your Exxons and your Sunocos have been doing, while the rest of the stock market has been going up. If you'd put $1,000 into clean energy companies 3 years ago, you'd be up 60%. If you'd put the same money in petroleum stocks, yeah, not so much. So there's an argument to be made that this is really the hot action here. Your first thought might be, oh, how about solar power? Like solar is clearly the way to go, right? And yes, solar power is totally exploding. US solar capacity is skyrocketing the last few years. And in fact, the electrical capacity of this country we're expecting to build is 70% solar and wind. There's no more coal. No more coal plants are expected to be built in the United States. Coal is over, effectively. Even the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum a couple of years ago put solar panels on its roof. They're saving $10,000 a year in energy costs. So something really amazing happened last year. This is our use of coal each year in the United States. Last year, for the first time, sustainable power consumption in the US surpassed coal power. Historic, unbelievable. And overall, you can see why that is. It's because the cost of solar has plummeted, and much faster than any expert could have predicted. It's gotten so cheap. And that's really great for the world, but really poor for investors. That is the rub. You don't want to invest in something whose value continues to drop. Solar cells are a commodity at this point. China is making them cheaply and dumping them on the market. So not a great place to put your money. You could say the same thing for wind. Again, the capacity in the US is just, it's the same story. We're building so much capacity, and yet the price is going lower and lower and lower. Good for the planet, poor for investment returns. At the same time, many states are imposing new laws that require them to buy clean energy. So California, New York, and Hawaii all have rules that 50% of all the power they buy by 2030 must be renewable. So where can you invest where you can take advantage of that? Well, the answer is the utility companies that make and buy the clean energy. So if you're a power utility, generating your power from wind or solar, think about it. There are no raw materials. There are no scrubbers to build. There are no US EPA laws to comply with. It's free energy for them. And think about it. They're not going to lower your rates as their costs going down, will they? No. So they're going to be more profitable, is the bottom line. So companies like NextEra and Xcel Energy are considered by the experts I talk to great plays for the future. Other good sector bets, we've already talked about how the world is going to need more clean water. So companies that make water processing equipment, the entire farm belt as the world warms is going to shift northward. So we know that big seed companies like Monsanto and Syngenta, those are good investment bets. And companies that make the farm equipment will be in good shape too. John Deere and Navistar, because as the farms move northward, more people will be buying more farm equipment in new places. Another thought you might have is electric cars. Every car company there has already announced that they are going to switch to making some electric cars or solely electric cars. I'm sure you saw this unbelievable headline last week. General Motors, the oldest, most calcified corporate, slow-moving corporation you've ever heard of, announced that they are going to phase out gas cars. They're not going to make any more. And by 2035, they're going to get rid of gas cars in 15 years. And they changed their logo to look more like a little plug. Really shocking in historic news. All told, you can see that the number of electric cars are coming to market is going through the roof. I don't know how many of you guys have ever driven one, but they are really fun to drive. They're 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 4 seconds. And that's if you buy the cheapest one. 2 years ago, I splurged on the cheapest Tesla, the Model 3, that's currently about $37,000 before the rebates you get from Connecticut, which is $3,000, and the government, which that might have phased out completely. But depending on where you live, you get these rebates on an electric car. Haven't bought gasoline in 2 years. The thing has 1/100th as many moving parts as a gas car, which has to have a whole engine, pistons, and filters, and spark plugs and carburetor. Electric car doesn't have any of that stuff. So there's no maintenance at all. Pretty amazing. So anyway, so gas cars are on the way out. And you might think, oh, how good of General Motors, how smart of them, how altruistic for the planet. I'm a little more cynical than that, because if you look at the world, more and more countries have announced that they will no longer sell gas cars. And that's California too, by the way. So what GM is responding to is, we have to sell these cars globally. Pretty soon we won't have anyone to buy them unless they're electric. But still, good news. All right, so how do you invest? Well, you could invest in these individual car companies, of course, or you could get smart. You could think upstream from all of the car companies and think about the companies that make the batteries. There are 4 of them. They are all Asian. Even Tesla's batteries are made by Panasonic. So you could invest in Panasonic or Samsung or LG Chemical, or you could invest in the companies that make the components for electric cars, the wires and the connectors, like Aptiv and Valeo, or all of these batteries are lithium ion batteries, the same thing, that's bigger versions of what's in your phone or your laptop. And the lithium has to come from somewhere. They come from mines. And 2 of the big ones that you can invest in are this American company, Albemarle, or there's this Chilean mining company. those are all going to be good bets in the coming years because we're all going to need lithium batteries. This chapter, it might be where a lot of you are turning off your laptops and going to bed because, like, really, an insurance chapter? I had so much fun in the insurance chapter. I spent all summer interviewing insurance people, and my wife says I'm a gas at parties now. Like, I could hold forth for 2 hours on the National Flood Insurance Program. It's just, but the truth is that most people, for most people, insurance is a weak spot right now. You've heard this saying, 15 minutes will save you 15% or more. 15 minutes is not enough to get to know your insurance policy. For example, increasingly, your insurance policies were not designed to withstand the natural disasters we're getting. This graph shows the number of flooding claims we've had in recent years. There are not only more of them, but the size of them are going way up. And here's one takeaway. If you learn nothing else from this talk tonight, well, then it was a really bad talk. But here's one really important thing to learn, and that is your homeowner's insurance does not cover flood damage. None of you, unless you bought flood insurance separately, none of you have flood insurance. And if any of you live on, Connecticut, then you are at risk of flood damage. So it turns out that almost no private insurance companies cover flood insurance anymore. When the hurricanes came along in 1992, Hurricane Andrew, and wiped out Florida, all the insurance companies either went out of business or left the state because they're like, in this new era, there's no way we can afford to reimburse people for flood insurance. There's just flood damage. There's too much of it. So that's when, in the 70s, Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program, which now covers 95% of all policies. It's a disaster of a program. They're $25 billion in debt from all these hurricanes. Unlike car insurance, they don't raise your rates when you file a claim. There's this one house in Texas that's been flooded something like 21 times since 1970, and they just keep rebuilding every time. The government pays them every single time. $3 million they spent on that one house to keep rebuilding. Their measurements of your rates are super coarse. So it'll be like your zip code or your half of the neighborhood, not what is the elevation of your particular house. So in October, they're supposed to revise all this, and they're going to come up with a far more finely grained rating of your risk levels. It's called Risk Rating 2.0. What it means, though, is that there will be two categories of people with flood insurance. There's the population of people who've been paying too little all these years because of those coarse measurements. Their rates are going to jump up and they'll be furious. And there's the population of people who've been paying too much all these years. Their rates will suddenly drop and they'll be furious because why have I been paying too much all these years? So good luck with that one, Congress. Anyway, for the insurance companies, the new era is a really tricky problem. They've really, when they're paying out so much money in flood and fire payments, they really have only three options. They can drop you as a customer, and they're dropping California fire customers by the hundreds of thousands. They can raise your rates, and they're all doing that. Homeowners insurance rates in some part of the countries have doubled in the last 10 years, or they can just pull out and leave the state. And nobody's exactly sure how this is going to work out. I mean, you might think, oh, the insurance companies are these fat cats. They are profit-making entities. At the same time, if they go under, they don't do anybody any good. So a lot of interesting talk at the insurance conferences these days about what's going to happen. And the last chapter I was going to talk about is this general one called Ready for Anything. There are certain cheap things that you can do now to get yourself ready for all the things that could come to pass: flood, hurricane, heat wave, high winds, droughts, mosquitoes, social unrest. And I'll give you some pointers for general preparation. Here's something I think you should all do this weekend. It takes 2 minutes. You download this app from the American Red Cross. It's free. It's called Emergency. And what you do is you enter your address, your kid's address, your school, your place of work, And then you can put the app away in a folder on your phone somewhere and forget about it. And the cool thing is, if any disaster ever starts coming your way to one of those addresses, this app wakes up and starts beeping to get your attention. You get early warning for any kind of disaster, not just weather disasters, man-made disasters, nuclear waste spills and chemical explosions and stuff like that. It's just a great little peace of mind, because you've seen the helicopter shots of people stuck in traffic trying to snake their way out from a hurricane or a wildfire. You don't want to be at the back of that line. You want to be at the front of the line. A lot of people are preparing go bags these days. This is a backpack that you keep by the front door in a closet or something. And it's got everything you need to grab and leave the house and survive for a day or two. So it's snacks, it's first aid kit, bug spray, sunscreen. You'll want, at the time you want to bring some cash and some ID too. You grab that on your way out the door. But rather than rushing around when you get word to evacuate, trying to assemble all this, have it already assembled. It's a great idea. One thing that all of these weather disasters have in common is drinking water problems. So in a wildfire, you get ash and nitrates running into the topsoil, running into the water table, and the water gets contaminated. In floods, as you know, the water gets contaminated. Most American cities were built where the sewage piping under the ground and the rainwater runoff piping are one and the same system. So when in these extreme rains we're getting these days, the treatment plants can't handle the volume of water. So they overflow, and boom, you've got poop in your drinking water. So when those things happen, you might think, well, that's why we fill our bathtub before a storm. Well, I don't know if you want to drink out of your bathtub, but there are some clean sources of water that you already have in the house. For example, your hot water heater. There's 40 or 80 gallons of water, clean, fresh, pre-contaminated water. You close off the inlet at the top, and then you open the outlet at the bottom, fill your bucket, let it cool down, clean, chlorinated, ready to go water. Your toilet has a few gallons of good water in it too. And I don't mean the bowl, unless you're a Labrador. I mean the tank. That is clean, untouched, perfectly clean water. Some people buy these cheap water storage tanks from Home Depot. The FDA says that water like this can stay drinkable indefinitely as long as the seal isn't opened and you are sanitary about filling it. And there's also water in the pipes of your house. If you have more than one story, you can open all the faucets at the top story, and then when you turn on the faucet on the bottom story, clean water comes out. So keep that in mind next time we get a Connecticut storm warning. Then there's also the concept of gray water. This is water for bathing, washing dishes, watering your garden, watering your dog. That's when you fill the bathtub. Although if your bathtub looks like that one, you can probably drink from that one. People put rain barrels out for their gutters to run into, so they've always got gray water ready to drink. Your pool or hot tub water can be used for that too. Another common thread behind all of these weather disasters is power failures. Power failures we lead the world in power failures, the United States, among developed countries. And they're getting much more frequent. The only real solution here is, of course, to get a generator. That sounds expensive, and some of them are, but the portable kind here that you fill with gas and start up like a lawnmower, that'll keep your refrigerator going, keep all your food safe, recharge your phones and stuff. That costs about $250 at Home Depot or Lowe's. These inverter generators aren't as loud and stinky, but they're much more expensive. And then if you've got the dough, you get a standby generator. That's the kind that sits out in the yard and it's ready to go all the time, fed by natural gas lines. After Hurricane Sandy, we were really cold here in this house. For 6 days, we had no power, no heat, no internet. Young kids and I swore, never again. I'm springing for the generator. But you don't have to get one big and expensive enough to power the whole house. So ours is a small one, only enough for the living room, the kitchen, and one bedroom. And so that way we don't really suffer in an outage, but nor do we spend $1 million. But I mean, you can even go really low end. This I found on Amazon for $15. It's a hand cranked generator. It's got a flashlight, an emergency radio, and it's just enough to charge your phone, your iPad, and so on. So you hand crank it, never need to worry about batteries. Another thing that happens when the power goes out is the cell phones go out. Cell towers are powered by electricity. So in all these major disasters, 9/11, Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, and all the wildfires, the cell towers lose power and the cell service goes down. Sometimes they have these diesel generators, they can wheel up to them and plug in them and get them going again. But the people in California found that that was no help at all, because guess what? There was a wildfire and Verizon couldn't get their diesel generators into the forest where these towers were. So pretty much a disaster. Think ahead now about what's going to happen if you and your family are separated when the disaster hits and you don't have cell phone service. What are you going to do? So this is the last bit of advice. Make a plan now. Over Saturday night dinner, discuss 4 spots. First of all, where in the house, if there's a storm, a windstorm or hurricane, can you all gather where you're far away from windows, because windows are what break, blow in, and cut you. Maybe a closet upstairs, maybe there's a basement, but agree now so you know where to meet. Figure out a spot close by if you're not allowed in your house, like if you're told to evacuate, like, oh, that crooked tree across from the Casey's house down the street. You want a place in town if some disaster happens when you're at work and the kids are at school, like we'll meet at the library or we'll meet at the temple or the church or whatever. Just agree in advance where you'll gather. And they even say pick an out of town spot in case the whole town has to be evacuated and they won't let you back onto your street. Where will that be? Well, we'll meet at the Costco's, we'll meet at, the Starbucks on 53rd and 5th, whatever. But agree on these things in advance, print it on a little card or put it on a notes page on your phone and make sure everybody has it, because you might not remember 2 years from now when this event comes to pass. The experts also recommend designating an out-of-town relative or friend who can be your communications hub when you are all scattered and you can't communicate with each other. You can call this one person, tell them where you are and how you are. Now I'm going to give you a bonus page, and this is a Connecticut special. It's the Lyme disease business. What's happening, of course, is that the winters are warmer and shorter. So the tick and the mosquito babies don't die off as much. And so we're getting more ticks and mosquitoes in more places. They're marching northward as high as Canada. And in this country, this shows that their territory. In this state, in fact, we're getting so many more cases of Lyme disease than we were in like 1996. The CDC gets 30,000 cases reported, but they believe that most people, 90%, don't even know they have Lyme disease. So they think the number is more like 300,000. They think it's a much bigger quantity. I had a lot of fun researching ticks. You think, you go outside and they're waiting in the trees, watching to see if someone comes by, and then they jump down on you. None of that's true. So here are some fun facts about ticks, many of which I think you might find reassuring. Most ticks, most species of ticks, do not carry disease. Even most of the black-tailed deer ticks that do carry Lyme disease don't carry Lyme disease. If you catch it early, antibiotics cure Lyme disease for good. So it's not a lost situation if you have it. Ticks cannot fly or jump. They don't even have eyes. So what they do is they stand on plants at ground level with their little forearms waving in the air, and they wait for an animal or a person to walk by, and then they grab onto you, and that's how you get a tick on you. It's relatively easy to avoid that fate. Put insect repellent that contains DEET on you and your clothes. It's the most studied chemical on Earth. It is completely safe. It doesn't kill anything. It's just a repellent. Ticks and mosquitoes don't like it. Put on DEET before you go for a walk. You're fine. Also, I found this interesting. Ticks require humidity. They cannot stand dryness. They die in dryness. Once the humidity drops under 82%, they shrivel up and die. So that's why when you come back from a hike, one great tip, take off your clothes, chuck them in the dryer for 10 minutes on high. And while you're standing there naked, look over yourself for these ticks, because they have to be on you for 48 hours on your skin before you can get Lyme disease. So if you check and you find them, and they can be tiny, so look carefully, but it's very possible you'll catch them and you can pull them off. Another way to use this humidity fact is if you build sort of a moat of grass 9 feet around your house, to them, that's Death Valley. On a sunny day, they can't cross that. It's too hot and dry. By the way, there is one situation where the internet is not giving you factual information. Hard to believe, I know. And that is the advice on removing a tick from your body. They say, use a match, use Vaseline, use rubbing alcohol. No, just grab it by the head with tweezers and pull straight out. That's it. Don't do any of those fancy things. And then if you feel kindly toward your fellow man, you will mail the thing in a sealed Ziploc bag to tickencounter.org. That's the guy I interviewed for the book. He collects tick samples from all over the country that people mail in to study where they're coming from, where they're growing, which species are where, how old they were when they're biting you, stuff like that. And he publishes really great information. My editor and I thought long and hard about another chapter in the book about social unrest. I mean, you think about Hurricane Katrina, it was like the 1850s. There was no electricity, no water, no air conditioning, no communications, TV, radio, no police, no government presence. I mean, it was the Wild West. It was a free-for-all. When the chips are down, authority and social structure can break down. So we actually had a conversation about whether this book should cover the gun question. Beliefs about guns are very different depending on who you are, where you grew up, and the culture you grew up in. I'm sure you know all the statistics about how dangerous they are to have in a house. 13,000 children every year are accidentally shot. You're 3 times more likely to commit suicide. So I actually spoke to a survival expert and a gun owner who made a really amazing point. He said, if authority has broken down and you're holed up in your house and you're worried about home intrusion, you're worried about people wanting food, wanting money, wanting to rob you, it's much easier than that. Lighting. Go to Home Depot and buy some $10 solar charged house lights. These guys don't particularly care about robbing your house. They just want to rob someone's house. So if yours is brightly lit and they have nowhere to hide, they're going to go somewhere else. He also recommended one of these. I'd never heard of this. This is a tactical flashlight. These are used by the military and law enforcement. Getting blasted in the face with this light it's bright and it's disorienting and it's confusing. It's almost painful. Criminals, muggers, and drug dealers hate drawing attention to themselves. They will back away. As one guy said, I've actually had really good luck with just one of these flashlights directly in their face and a stern, hey, back the beep up. And he says, I've diffused quite a few sketchy individuals that way. I promised you that the end of the talk would not be depressing. And here we go. The last chapter of the book and of this talk is Where to Find Hope. It is true that for the last 4 years, the US as a federal government did absolutely nothing about climate change. In fact, as you may have heard, the administration scrubbed the words climate change from all US agency websites. That has changed radically in the last couple of weeks with a new president who considers climate change a top priority. But even before the inauguration, there were some really exciting signs. This is a graph of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. It has been dropping for several years. Now, that's not because we're all being good citizens and taking public transportation and installing LED light bulbs. It's mostly because of fracking, because natural gas emits fewer emissions than coal and oil, but it is still dropping. Now, I mentioned that the United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement and did nothing for 4 years. Well, guess what? Half the country joined an organization called We Are Still In. Half the states
stayed on target with the Paris Accord, and Connecticut's one of them. And many hundreds of 484 mayors also agreed to stay committed. These are all the cities who've promised to go to the Paris goal of 100% renewable power by 2030. And many of the cities are actually already there. So really exciting. New investment in clean energy is going through the roof. And I always used to think that corporations were the bad guys, right? You think of companies as the big polluters, but even companies, all these companies have committed to 100% renewable. And it's really interesting. Here again, it's out of the goodness of their hearts. Corporations today are getting pressure from three directions. First of all, the public, obviously. The public increasingly cares if you're a polluter. Second, from the investors. The investment community sees climate liability as a risk. They don't want a company exposed to, for example, a country passing a carbon tax. These carbon pricing schemes, many analysts think this is an inevitable development, that pretty soon a company will have to pay to pollute. That's one of the strongest tools we have to rein in climate change. So investors care how much these companies are polluting. And the third force is the employees. The employees themselves are pressuring the companies from within to clean up their act. You may remember that as of 2 years ago, Amazon.com had no climate plan. And then the employees practically had a mutiny. And thousands and thousands signed this petition and pressured Jeff Bezos. And sure enough, last year he said, okay, we're spending $10 billion on climate research. We're buying 100,000 electric vans for delivery. We are starting our own wind and solar farms, and so on. Became a really good environmental citizen. All these big tech companies, Google has been 100% renewable since 2017. Apple has announced that by 2030, 9 years, they will be carbon neutral. Now be careful, a lot of these companies announce that they're carbon neutral, but you know what carbon neutral means? It means, yes, they still pollute, but on the side, they remove as much carbon from the air as they're putting up. And they're doing that by funding reforestation projects and things like that. So most companies say we're going to be carbon neutral by whatever year. They're just talking about their headquarters. They're not talking about the suppliers that make the raw ingredients, and they're not talking about the products they make and the people who use them. Those are known as scopes 1, 2, and 3 for you nerds. But Apple intends to be all three scopes, the supply chain, the corporation, and their products, to be carbon neutral in 9 years. An astonishing feat. And then Microsoft says by 2050, they won't just be carbon neutral. They will have removed from the air all the carbon they've ever put up there since their founding in 1979. I mean, we'll see if they can pull it off, but it's a pretty astonishing goal. So overall, the conclusion of this book and this talk is there are really two reasons to prepare for the extremes of the changing climate. One is the obvious one. You'll be ready when a disaster comes. Study after study after study shows that if you have water in hand, if you have a generator, if you have a go bag, if you get early warning, if you are insured, you'll suffer less in weather disasters. And again, if you live in Connecticut, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. These things are coming and they're getting worse. But there's a second stealth reason to do this kind of preparation. Study after study also shows this, that when you've taken these steps to prepare, you feel better. You sleep better at night. Because it turns out the definition of depression and despair over something like the climate is not, oh, it's a bad situation. It's, oh, it's a bad situation and I'm helpless to do anything about it. So by taking steps like this, you do feel better because you're seizing some control back again for yourself. I do think that the world is going to decarbonize. On day one, the new president, as you know, rejoined the climate agreement, canceled these really polluting oil pipeline projects, and restored the automotive industry mileage goals. So there's a lot happening really fast, much to be cheered about. It'll take 50 or 80 years, I think, before we stop burning fossil fuels entirely. But if you look at the young people today who are going to replace us as we die off, it's pretty obvious what they care about. And it's pretty obvious that the world is going to get there. But between now and then, you have really only one option, and that is to prepare. So thank you very much for your patience with my technical problems. I'm happy to take questions and discuss any of the above.
Well, thank you, David. Fascinating talk. I want to encourage people to put their questions into the chat room, not the Q&A if possible. I have a couple of things here that are comments more than questions. Let's see.
I see several people talking about, I see a few talking about kidney stones. Can I mention why that
Yes,
is?
yes, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I myself, I'm a kidney stone sufferer. I've had 3 of them. Awful, the worst pain the human body can do to itself. And yes, even worse than childbirth, according to women who've had both babies and kidney stones. And the reason they're more frequent is that a kidney stone occurrence is linked to dehydration. So think about the macro picture of summers that are getting hotter, people outdoors not drinking enough. In the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, our troops had skyrocketing rates of kidney stones. And that's why. Those are hot, dry countries, and they were not drinking enough. A hotter world leads to more kidney stones.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, so we have hyper-individualism and hyper-consumption, and a lack of collective action is a large part of what has brought us to this environmental crisis. Why do you feel comfortable focusing on save yourself, every person for himself, recommendations?
That isn't the message of the book. As we know, there are 2 different ways to respond. There's mitigation. And in mitigation, I feel like that the advice there has been really well hammered into our heads at this point. We know what we have to do to stop putting climate gas emissions into the air. And as the book says, this business about preparing yourself does not mean you can stop mitigating. The actual quote in the book is, we have to do both as hard and fast as possible. That said, this is a book, this is advice that could save 25 million people and their families and their homes a year. So clearly the government is not going to help you. Look what happened in Katrina, look what happened in Sandy. The government wasn't there to help you. So it's really up to you to take responsibility for some of your own preparation. I don't really see it as, I will admit that the book appeals to the selfish in that it is designed to save your life, save your kids, save your home. I'm not sure that's a bad kind of selfish. I think it's a self-interest that's entirely understandable. But there's a lot in the book about the importance of collective action. I've outlined pages and pages of organizations that you can and should join, because let's face it, changing your light bulbs to LEDs is not going to make a dent in the changing climate. But voting for someone who cares about climate change, or writing an editorial for the paper, or joining a march, or joining a group, that actually stands a chance. So the answer is yes, we need to mitigate and adapt really hard.
Thank you. Now, I'd forgotten, you had prepared a couple poll questions. So do we want to have those pop up now and get some audience response on that?
Sure, we're going to use the Zoom poll feature. Do you remember how it works?
Hopefully, Troy. Here we go.
Oh, that's easy. Okay, so question number 1, have you and your family ever discussed emergency plans, like how you would coordinate if the network is down? So just click yes, no, or not applicable. The second question is, how familiar are you with exactly what's in your insurance policy? Are you really familiar with it? Do you have sort of the general idea? Or it's really been a while since I looked at it? I'll be fascinated to see what you guys vote. And finally, do you know anybody who has considered the future of climate in choosing where to live? Yes, no, or yeah, and it's me. So I'd love you to click your answers, and I presume we'll be able to see the answers right away.
Yeah, so I'm seeing that in the first question about have you discussed emergency plans with your family? At this point now, 72% of our respondents say no, and 26% say yes. And in the second question, are you familiar with exactly what's in your insurance policy? 47% say I have a general idea. 18%, I'm very familiar. And 35%, it's really been a while. So I just see on my screen, I just see those two. I don't see the oh, here's the third. Do you know anybody who has considered the future of climate and choosing where to live? So yes, 23%. Yes, and it's me, 26%. And no, about 51%. So I know for me personally,
Thank you guys for doing it.
We talk sometimes about buying an apartment in New York City, and I say I will never buy one there because I think that Hurricane Sandy is not a one-time event. And if you're renting, at least you can walk away and leave the keys. And my husband's from Buffalo, so it's sort of ironic. He left it at 17, didn't want to go back, and if now that's an ideal place to live, I don't know how he's going to deal with that issue.
Oh, cool. There's the poll results. I think that's fascinating. I think it's, I mean, it gives me great hope because it means the book, in insisting that most people have not actually discussed with their family disaster plans and insisting that most people are not all that familiar with their insurance policies, was correct. I mean, it tells me that I was right on those points.
So, okay, so I think probably most people have responded to this by now. So yeah, so that's, even if a few more people have responded, that's kind of the drift. So I think there's room for improvement on how we deal with the future.
Boy, do I have a book for you.
Okay, so let's see. Along with Barbara Friedman asks, along with the line of the increase of kidney stones, doctors are saying that there is also a huge increase in appendicitis in people over 60. Is there any correlation?
Wow, I didn't know about the appendicitis.
A friend of ours just was in the hospital from that in her early 80s, but I don't know if there's any connection. All right, well, let's see what other questions.
I was going to say one general aspect of all the different climate change effects is more people getting sick more often. I mean, just the mosquitoes and the ticks alone are bringing this long list of horrifying tropical diseases into the US. And so that's why when I interview these experts about places to live, hospital presence was always up there on the list. I mean, you might be really happy out in some rural place, but you really want to be near medical facilities in the new era.
Okay, so now here is a question. Whoops, just bounced. Okay, can you comment on how individual choices on the food that they buy and consume, where farmed and how, connects to the emissions from the agricultural sector? Those are on par with CO2 emissions from the utilities. I would not feel comfortable about Monsanto and similar companies that have promoted the terrible farming practices of the past umpteen years. Highly recommend the documentary Kiss the Ground on the topic of agricultural contributions to greenhouse gases. So that's sort of maybe a comment more than a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic question, fantastic point. So individual choices on food. Again, I did not want this to be the 5,000th book on reducing your carbon footprint. I feel like that has been really covered. I did write a 100-page free appendix to the book that anyone can download from the Simon & Schuster website on what steps can you do to reduce your carbon footprint to mitigate climate change. And the biggest part of it was what you eat. This is the #1 change that an individual or a family can make. And that is because, ready for this, of cows. We Americans eat so much beef. The average American eats 2.5 pounds of beef a day. And at this point, this will blow your mind. 1/3 of the entire Earth's non-frozen surface is cattle grazing land. This is why in Brazil, they're burning down the rainforest. It's to make more room for cattle grazing. They are also enormous water hogs. They're also enormous feed hogs. All the grain and corn we feed these cows, it takes 8 pounds of it that we could be eating to provide 1 pound of finished beef. So they're the most wasteful, most ridiculous food commodity in the world. And here's the kicker. A single cow belches up 12 gallons of methane an hour. Methane, if you don't know, is a greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide, only 80 times worse at trapping heat. So it is horrible stuff. And these cows belch it out by the hundreds of thousands of tons. So I know it's a tough sell to say, Americans, you should stop eating red meat. They won't, but maybe you could do it twice a week instead of 5 times. Or one of Diego Rose, this professor I interviewed at Tulane, he said, maybe you could consider the protein flip. And what that is, instead of visualizing dinner as a slab of beef surrounded by some vegetables and some carbohydrates, flip it. Make little pieces of beef, the delicious bites in the rice, in the stir fry, in the noodles. Flip the preponderance of each. And there are a lot of chefs and a lot of academics who are working on this problem too. I love this study, you guys. There was a study where on a restaurant menu, they took the vegetarian section out and moved the dishes listed among the other meat dishes, right? So it wasn't like, here's the box for vegetarians. Instead, they were all commingled. And guess what? The number of people who ordered vegetarian dishes doubled because of the stigma being removed. So yes, individual choices on the food you consume is the #1 change you and your family can make toward lowering the amount of climate gases. Now, in the United States, we have been lowering the amount of beef we eat by 10% in the last 30 years or so. The problem is China and India. I've heard beef there referred to as millionaire's meat. So to them, it's a real delicacy. It's a really fancy thing. So the amount of beef consumption there is going through the roof as the middle classes rise. So that's a real problem. On the other hand, China's president announced earlier last year that they're going to be carbon neutral as a country by 2160. So we'll see how close they get to that. So anyway, thank you for asking, Uma, about individual choices. On Monsanto and companies developing the drought-resistant seeds, yeah, that's just, I'm not saying they're angels. I'm saying if you want to put your money where climate change is, that's where it would be. And the documentary Kiss the Ground, I would love to see that. Yeah, the climate change gases we produce in this country are roughly a third. It's agriculture, it's transportation, and it's manufacturing and industry. So 2 of those you have control over.
Great, thank you. How does climate change impact home design and city design and planning?
Another great question. As the planet heats, we use more air conditioning. That's obvious. In the summer, your air conditioner is responsible for about half of your electric bill price. It's a real problem. And also an air conditioner works by taking heat from the inside and pumping it outside, right? So all these air conditioners contribute to what's called the heat island effect. That's where the city itself, because of the air conditioning and because of all the pavement, is 10 or 20 degrees hotter than the countryside outside, which again, always tends to impact poorer communities the worst. So there was a time before air conditioning. In the deep South, they had architectural practices that could keep houses cool enough. And they had things like tall ceilings. Those old plantation houses have really high ceilings because guess what? Heat rises. So it stays cooler down where you are. They had these flow through hallways from the front of the house to the back so that breezes could develop and blow through. And they had wraparound porches. People could spend the day outside in the shade. And we've forgotten all about some of those techniques. I mean, there's some of those layouts would work for many parts of the country. In terms of urban design, it's the same thing. There are huge strides being made in what we know about urban design. Chicago, for example, is one of the cities that has that flooding problem. When they have big rains, they literally get raw sewage coming up from their toilets because they have that overflowing sanitation problem. So Chicago has undertaken some really cool adaptation techniques. One is they're in the middle of a 40-year construction project, these massive underground pipes and cisterns that will handle the overflow rain, like trillions of gallons. And this project isn't supposed to be finished till the 2040s, but it's a really cool thing. I want to do a CBS Sunday Morning story about this huge public works program. But Chicago is simultaneously doing things like repaving side streets with permeable pavement. This is pavement that water can trickle down into the ground instead of building up into floodwaters, flooding basements, and pooling and collecting lakes in the streets. They're also giving away water barrels for people who would like them, who can catch the rainwater as gray water into these barrels, thus keeping even more water out of the system. So yeah, urban design. And of course, parks. New York City is planning this big, they call it the Big U. It's a big ring of protective berms and parks on the southern tip of the island, where the sea levels make the storms the worst, the flooding the worst. And the plants and trees they're planting there are going to be much more things like mangroves. They're sort of things you're used to thinking of in swampy land because they're thirsty trees. So the idea is you can use nature to help you manage all this flooding in the big cities.
Great. So I'm trying to think, because I know we're getting close to 9 o'clock. And so let's see. What about soil carbon sequestration? Someone has mentioned support the proposed Agricultural Resistance Act, but do you see this sequestration as creating much of a difference?
Yeah, I think you're talking about these experiments about sucking carbon dioxide out of the air and either storing it underground, or a lot of these experiments are reusing the carbon dioxide as things like fuels, building it into concrete, or even using them as carbonation in carbonated beverages. There are about 11 of these plants up and running right now, pulling tons of carbon dioxide out of the air. The UN considers this an essential part of reaching the climate goals, the Paris Agreement goals. Like, without these carbon removal systems, we won't get there. At the same time, it's currently costing $100 a ton to remove carbon dioxide from the air. It's way too expensive to be practical. They need to get it much, much, much cheaper. You know, technology, it may happen. Prices do fall. And it's really exciting to know that there is a scientific principle that can do that. I would consider these carbon sequestration techniques a lot more practical and realistic than the really nutty ones that you hear about. Like, there are people proposing spraying reflective powder through the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight and stuff like that, or having ships sail across the ocean, spraying salts into the air to form low-level clouds to make light reflect before it hits the water. I would call those really speculative and potentially dangerous. Like, if you're blocking sunlight, what about our agriculture? Like, plants need sun. Like, you can't just turn off the sun. And also, the atmosphere does not know national boundaries. So whose hand is on the throttle here? Like, could the United States make it all dark and cloudy on our enemy countries? You know, so they're kind of fraught, but fun to talk about.
Great. So now I think since we're in the northwest corner of Connecticut, the foothills of the Berkshires, and pretty far away from the ocean, is our area right here as, you know, very vulnerable as well, or are we relatively safe compared to a lot of other places?
Well, you're certainly much safer than you would be if you were on the coast. You do have to worry about the ticks and the mosquitoes. And of course, flooding is not unique to people on the coast. In fact, here's something incredible I found out researching the book. 7 of the 10 most flooded states in America, as determined by how many are declared federal disaster areas, are not coastal states. They're inland states who are just getting these massive, intensive rains, and then the water has nowhere to go. One characteristic of the changing climate is an alternation of drought and intense rain. So the ground gets all dry and hard, and then the rain comes and the water can't soak into the earth. So it just forms flooding. But yeah, I would say in general, you are in a great place in terms of temperature, in terms of wildfire, in terms of heat wave. So you're halfway there.
Great. Okay, is there any correlation between a changing climate and the potential for pandemics in the future?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. There's a sidebar box in the book about the relationship between the pandemic and the changing climate. It's not very direct, but there are some similarities and some interconnections. So for example, both the climate problems and the pandemic problems often result from overcrowding. So it is said that the COVID pandemic began at a wet market in China, where we are interacting with nature in unhealthy ways, bats in that example. And in the same way, people die and lose their homes in wildfires and hurricanes by building in poorly chosen places. You would not believe how many California homes are built right next to the forest. In the last 20 years, it's been something like 60% of the homes. That's crazy. They're setting themselves up for wildfire disaster. And as you know, Florida, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, they've been building in low-lying floodplains for decades. And hate to say it, kind of asking for it. So there is this sense of overcrowding and pushing into nature where we shouldn't be that are triggering both of these problems. There's also a really interesting point about this, which is that the presidential administration hopes to lick or address the pandemic and climate change simultaneously with the same kinds of legislation. And you might say, well, how is that possible? What on earth do they have to do with each other? And as one expert explained to me, it's the notion of, the New Deal or public works projects. It's the notion of spending a lot of money, trillions of dollars, because we have to, because it's time, all at the same time. In other words, it's a reset. It's a reset for everything. So we may as well lick both problems at the same time.
Great. Well, I'll just maybe one more question. Unless, is there anything that in the questions that hasn't come up that you want to comment on as your last sort of question answer? Otherwise, I just have one question here saying, aside from updating flood insurance, what do you see as the most important precaution to take?
Well, I think you've heard them. I think have a plan. And by the way, if you have a small business, there's a chapter in here on how to protect your small business too. You need a plan too. FEMA has this unbelievable statistic. If your small business has not reopened its doors 6 days after a weather disaster, the odds are 50% that you will never reopen. So we saw that with COVID, right? Small businesses by the hundreds of thousands will never reopen. So you too need a plan. And for example, for businesses, there's this little kind of insurance that you can get. It's not much, it's like $150 a year, but it covers ongoing expenses when your business has had to shut down, like rent and paying your employees to stay on staff even when they're not coming to work every day. I mean, that one piece of insurance could see you through a disaster when everything else hasn't. As a small business owner, you could also make a deal now with either a competitor or a nearby business that if one of you has to shut down, you guys can move in together during the rebuilding phase. You can make small gestures like that. You should have go bags for your employees, and you should have a plan. Right? If there's a wildfire approaching, if there's flooding approaching, and you're ordered to evacuate the building, whose job is it to grab the backup hard drive? Whose job is it to turn off the power and the gas? Whose job is it to sweep the premises and make sure that all your people are out of the office, including the bathroom? So there's no reason you can't take an afternoon to go through these preparation steps now. And the beauty of it is that your employees will appreciate your concern for them.
Great. Well, thank you. I don't want to hold you too much longer, but I really appreciate you coming and talking with us tonight. It's been a fascinating talk. It's been a pleasure to meet you a little bit. And so I hope I've gotten lots of comments about people who've enjoyed your talk. So anyway, thank you so much. Hopefully.
I'd love to say just one more thing, which
Sure.
is that if you have any questions that I didn't get to, or would like to talk about any of this, you saw my email address before, but I'll give it to you again, pogue@me.com. My last name, Pogue. Here, I'll type it into the comments here. pogue@me.com is my email address. I welcome your thoughts on the talk, on climate change, or on the book. I signed 40 autographed book plates for the bookstore there to slap into the book, since I can't sign them for you in person. So at least you'll have the autograph there, and love to hear what you think.
Well, thank you so much. That's very generous, especially giving us your email address. I have a feeling that you might be hearing from some of our audience. So anyway, thank you again. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Really fun.